Hank, a golden retriever with a thick, honey-colored coat and a build more suited to lounging than leaping, watched the world from his corner of the animal shelter's play yard. He was a gentle giant, his round belly resting on the cool earth as his ears occasionally twitched at the distant sounds of barking. Visitors often passed him by, their eyes scanning for puppies or sprightly dogs who bounded to the fences. Hank's charm was quieter, and though the shelter staff adore him, his lethargic demeanor and substantial size didn't make him a first choice for adoption. The shelter was modest but welcoming, nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Late spring had painted the surroundings with life. The park across the street bloomed with wildflowers, their vibrant colors waving in the gentle afternoon breeze. Birds chirped from their perches, and children's laughter occasionally wafted in from the community center nearby. Inside the shelter, rows of kennels held an array of animals, each hoping for a chance at a new beginning. That sunny afternoon, Clarence strode into the shelter with the confidence of a man who had nothing to prove but everything to enjoy. A local legend among his peers, Clarence was an elderly millionaire with a penchant for whimsy. His silver hair gleamed under his signature hat, and his weathered face bore a playful smirk. Known for his impulsive bets and wild ideas, Clarence thrived on the thrill of challenges, no matter how trivial or monumental they might seem. Today's venture was born from one such whim. At a lunch gathering earlier, Clarence had wagered with his friends that he could turn any dog, no matter how overlooked, into a lively companion. The specifics of the bet were secondary to Clarence's enjoyment of the banter. But as the laughter subsided, he felt an odd flicker of purpose. Perhaps this wasn't just another pastime. Clarence greeted the shelter staff warmly, his eyes crinkling with genuine curiosity as he surveyed the kennel rows. We reached the play yard and spotted Hank. Something about the dog's unassuming presence struck him. Hank didn't rise to greet Clarence, but his soulful gaze, steady and unhurried, seemed to meet Clarence's with a quiet dignity. The other dogs barked or jumped excitedly, but Hank merely shifted slightly, his tail giving a single, lazy wag. "Well, aren't you a character?" Clarence muttered, more to himself than to anyone. He crouched by the fence, observing Hank's calm demeanor. The staff approached, explaining Hank's situation, his weight, his low energy, his history of being overlooked by adopters. Clarence nodded thoughtfully, his smirk deepening into a genuine smile. "I'll take him," Clarence said, his voice filled with the certainty that often accompanied his whims. The staff hesitated, ensuring Clarence understood the commitment required for a dog like Hank. Clarence waved them off with a chuckle. How hard could it be? As the adoption papers were finalized, Hank was led to Clarence, his wide, lumbering gait causing the leash to sway. Clarence knelt to meet him eye to eye. "Hank," he said, his tone soft but firm, "you and I are going to show the world what overlooked really means." Hank blinked slowly in response, his tail thumping twice against the shelter floor. The drive home was a quiet affair. Hank sprawled across the back seat of Clarence's vintage sedan, the worn leather creaking under his weight. Clarence glanced at him in the rearview mirror, chuckling as Hank seemed unimpressed by the passing scenery. The suburban streets stretched ahead, the late afternoon sun casting long, golden shadows across the pavement. Clarence spoke to Hank as though the dog could respond, sharing snippets of his life and the plans he had for their partnership. When they arrived at Clarence's home, a spacious but unassuming house with a sprawling backyard, Clarence led Hank inside, guiding him to a cozy corner prepared with a plush bed and a bowl of fresh water. Hank plopped down with a grunt, already claiming the space as his own. Clarence watched him for a moment before shaking his head and muttering, "You're going to make me work for this, aren't you?" That evening, as Clarence sipped tea on the porch and Hank dozed beside him, the quiet hum of the neighborhood enveloped them. Clarence's mind wandered to the bet he'd made, the challenge he had set for himself. It wasn't just about proving something to his friends. There was something oddly fulfilling about the thought of helping Hank discover a more vibrant life. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Clarence patted Hank's broad side, murmuring, "Here's to new beginnings, old boy." Hank stirred briefly, his tail wagging once before he settled back into sleep. Though neither knew it yet, this unassuming moment marked the start of an extraordinary journey. The next morning, sunlight streamed through Clarence's wide windows, casting warm patterns on the wooden floors. Hank lay sprawled in his new corner, his large frame rising and falling with slow breaths. Clarence stood nearby, a mug of coffee in hand, contemplating the day ahead. "Well, Hank," he said aloud, "a promise is a promise. Let's see what you've got." Getting Hank into the car for their first outing proved to be a challenge. The retriever, unbothered by Clarence's gentle coaxing, hesitated at the car door. With patience and a bit of effort, Clarence finally managed to lift Hank into the back seat. They drove to the nearby park, the air crisp and fragrant with blooming flowers. Clarence parked near the trail entrance and attached a sturdy leash to Hank's collar. The walk began slowly. Hank's paws patted softly on the gravel, his pace deliberate. Clarence adjusted his stride to match Hank's, chatting amiably as they moved. "This is just the start, my friend. A little bit every day, and you'll be bounding like a pup in no time." Hank, unimpressed, sniffed at a patch of grass before continuing his sluggish waddle. Despite his reluctance, Clarence couldn't help but smile at the dog's calm demeanor. Back home, Clarence set about creating a routine for the two of them. Each morning began with a walk, followed by a rest in the backyard. Clarence arranged small obstacles in the yard, hoping to engage Hank in some light activity. Initially, Hank showed little interest, but after a few days, he began to shuffle through the setup with a faint wag of his tail. Clarence rewarded each small effort with words of encouragement and gentle pats, slowly building Hank's confidence. Their progress didn't go unnoticed. Martha, Clarence's neighbor, observed their outings from her porch, her curiosity piqued. One afternoon, she wandered over, holding a plate of cookies. "Clarence," she said, her tone both amused and concerned, "what's all this with the dog? Looks like you've got quite the project." Clarence welcomed her company, sharing his story of Hank and the bet that started it all. Martha raised an eyebrow but softened as she watched Hank sniff around the yard. "Well," she said, setting the cookies aside, "he does seem sweet. Let me know if you need help. And maybe don't push him too hard." As days turned into weeks, Clarence and Hank settled into their rhythm. The walks grew slightly longer, and Hank began to show faint glimmers of enthusiasm. He wagged his tail more often and followed Clarence from room to room, his bond with the older man growing stronger. In the evenings, they rested together on the porch, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. But their journey was far from smooth. One afternoon, after a walk, Clarence noticed Hank struggling to climb the steps back into the house. Alarmed, he helped the dog inside and resolved to visit the veterinary clinic. The vet, a kind woman with a calm demeanor, examined Hank thoroughly. She recommended a strict diet and warned Clarence to keep the exercise light to avoid putting stress on Hank's joints. "It'll take time," she said. "Progress will be slow, but it's worth it." Clarence left the clinic with a renewed determination. He spent hours researching healthy meals for dogs and devised creative ways to incorporate exercise into their routine. During walks, he hid treats along the trail, encouraging Hank to move a bit more. In the yard, he replaced the simple obstacles with slightly more engaging setups, like low hurdles and small toys to retrieve. Though Hank's pace remained unhurried, his occasional wagging tail and softer gaze hinted at growing trust and interest. Still, doubts began to creep in. One evening, as Clarence and Hank strolled through the neighborhood, Clarence overheard a group of neighbors whispering nearby. "It's just a silly vanity project," one said. "That dog's never going to change." Clarence pretended not to hear, but the words stung. That night, as he sat with Hank on the porch, he wondered if the skeptics might be right. Was he trying too hard to change something that couldn't be changed? He sighed, watching the stars blink into view. Hank, as if sensing Clarence's unease, nudged his hand with a wet nose. The small gesture brought a smile to Clarence's face. "Well," Clarence murmured, stroking Hank's ears, I didn't think you'd be the one cheering me up. Let's show them what we're made of. Old boy. Hank gave a soft wag of his tail, settling beside Clarence. The doubts didn't vanish entirely, but Clarence resolved to push forward. He would take it one step at a time, just as Hank did. Weeks turned into months, and though Hank showed slight improvements, progress was slower than Clarence had hoped. The morning walks continued, but Hank's pace remained unhurried. His weight showed only minor changes, and his enthusiasm for exercises was sporadic at best. Clarence, ever the optimist outwardly, began to feel the weight of doubt creeping in. Was he truly helping Hank, or merely indulging in a project too ambitious for either of them? The tipping point came during one of their routine veterinary checkups. The vet, after carefully examining Hank, noted that his weight loss had plateaued. "It's common in cases like this," she explained gently. "We might need to try something different, like hydrotherapy. It's low impact and can help build his strength without putting pressure on his joints." Clarence raised an eyebrow. "Hydrotherapy? Like swimming? Hank and I aren't exactly Michael Phelps." The vet chuckled, but reassured him. "There's a wellness program at the community pool that offers animal sessions. It's worth considering." The suggestion lingered in Clarence's mind. A day later, he made the call, and before long, he and Hank found themselves standing at the edge of the pool, staring at the water. Hank, ever cautious, seemed less than thrilled about the prospect. His paws remained planted firmly on the tiles as Clarence gently coaxed him forward. "Come on, Hank," Clarence urged. "It's just water, not quicksand." After several attempts, Clarence finally succeeded in getting Hank into the pool. The golden retriever paddled clumsily, his movements hesitant but surprisingly effective. Clarence walked alongside the pool, cheering him on. "That's it, Hank. Look at you, moving like a champ." For the first time, Clarence saw a spark of curiosity and energy in Hank's usually placid demeanor. From that point on, swimming sessions became part of their routine. The water seemed to invigorate Hank, and though progress was still slow, Clarence noticed subtle changes. Hank's endurance improved, and his weight began to shift downward again. More importantly, his personality started to shine through. He greeted Clarence with a tail wag every morning, and his eyes carried a liveliness that hadn't been there before. Clarence adapted his own routine to support Hank's progress. He woke earlier to fit in morning walks and swim sessions, and he spent evenings preparing balanced, homemade meals for Hank. The eccentric millionaire, known for his whimsical bets, was now a dedicated caregiver, finding fulfillment in the quiet, steady rhythm of their days. Despite these small victories, challenges continued to arise. During one particularly energetic session in the backyard, Hank attempted to jog after a ball Clarence had thrown. The attempt ended with a stumble and a sprained paw. Clarence rushed to his side, his heart sinking at the sight of Hank's discomfort. The vet assured him it was a minor injury, but the setback weighed heavily on Clarence's mind. For the first time, he wondered if his efforts were doing more harm than good. That evening, Clarence sat on the porch with Hank, their usual routine interrupted by the injury. Hank lay beside him, his paw wrapped in a soft bandage. Clarence gazed at the stars, his thoughts clouded with uncertainty. "Maybe they're right," he muttered. "Maybe this is just a silly idea." Hank, as if sensing Clarence's despair, let out a soft bark. He shifted closer, resting his head on Clarence's knee. The gesture, simple yet profound, stirred something in Clarence. He stroked Hank's head, his resolve slowly returning. "You're not giving up on me, are you?" Clarence said with a small smile. "Then I won't give up on you either." The next morning, despite Hank's injury, Clarence adjusted their activities to accommodate his recovery. He carried Hank into the backyard and spent the afternoon sitting with him in the grass, encouraging small movements and rewarding each step with gentle praise. The bond between them deepened further, built on shared perseverance and quiet understanding. As they resumed their swimming sessions weeks later, Clarence noticed a change in the way neighbors viewed them. While some still whispered behind their backs, others began to stop and watch, offering words of encouragement instead of skepticism. Martha, who had once raised an eyebrow at Clarence's efforts, now joined him on their walks, sharing tips and even bringing Hank homemade treats, though Clarence carefully portioned them to avoid derailing Hank's progress. Even so, Clarence couldn't ignore the pressure that lingered. Comments about Hank's slow transformation, though rare, still found their way to his ears. "He's better," they'd say, "but is it enough?" One afternoon, as Clarence sat at the pool's edge watching Hank paddle with newfound confidence, he reflected on the journey so far. It wasn't just about proving the skeptics wrong anymore. It was about Hank, his resilience, his small triumphs, and the joy he brought to Clarence's life. As Hank climbed out of the pool and shook himself dry, sending droplets of water in every direction, Clarence laughed heartily for the first time in weeks. "Well, old boy," he said, wrapping a towel around Hank, "we've come this far. Let's see just how far we can go." A few weeks after Hank's recovery from his sprained paw, Clarence received an unexpected visit from Martha. She arrived at his door, her usual cheerful expression replaced with one of excitement. "You'll never guess," she began, waving a flyer. "The local community group is hosting a pet health awareness event. They're featuring stories like yours and Hank's. I told them about your journey, and they want you two to participate." Clarence hesitated, taking the flyer. The idea of standing in front of a crowd with Hank, who was still a work in progress, made him uneasy. "I don't know, Martha," he said, glancing at Hank, who was sprawled nearby, chewing on a soft toy. "We're not exactly show material." "Nonsense," Martha replied. "It's not about perfection. It's about the journey. And besides, you'd be helping others see what's possible." After much persuasion, Clarence reluctantly agreed. The event was set for a Saturday morning in the park where he and Hank had begun their walks. The program included a short demonstration of Hank's progress, as well as a brief speech from Clarence. It was a daunting prospect, but Clarence focused on preparing both himself and Hank. Over the next few days, he created a simple training routine, gradually building Hank's confidence. The morning of the event dawned bright and clear. The park was abuzz with activity, families with their pets, booths promoting pet wellness, and a small stage set up under a cluster of trees. Clarence arrived early with Hank, taking a quiet spot near the edge of the gathering to acclimate to the noise and movement. Hank seemed a bit overwhelmed, his tail wagging tentatively as he observed the commotion. When their turn came, Clarence led Hank to the stage. The crowd quieted as they approached, their faces a mix of curiosity and encouragement. Hank hesitated at the base of the steps, his large frame rigid. Clarence crouched beside him, speaking softly. "It's just like the art, Hank. We're in this together." With a deep breath, Clarence gently guided Hank onto the stage. The retriever walked slowly, his gait steady but cautious. The crowd clapped, their applause warm and encouraging. Clarence couldn't help but smile as Hank reached the center of the stage, his tail wagging slightly. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. During his speech, Clarence spoke about Hank's journey, focusing on the importance of patience, love, and second chances. "When I first met Hank," he said, his voice steady, "he was overlooked and maybe I was too. But together, we've learned that change doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, effort, and a lot of heart." As the audience applauded, Clarence glanced at Hank. The dog was alert, his eyes scanning the crowd. It was a small moment, but it felt monumental to Clarence. For the first time, Hank seemed to enjoy the attention, if only for a moment. But the peace didn't last. Just as they began to leave the stage, a loud noise from a nearby booth startled Hank. He froze, his body stiff, and his tail tucked low. Clarence knelt beside him again, whispering words of reassurance. Slowly, Hank took a step, then another, until they were safely off the stage. The crowd cheered, their support unshaken by the brief hiccup. As the event wound down, Martha joined Clarence and Hank under a shaded tree. "You two were wonderful," she said, offering Hank a small treat, which he accepted cautiously. Clarence, still unsure, asked, "Do you really think it mattered?" There's still so far to go. Martha smiled, her expression softening. Clarence, it's not about the destination. It's about the story you're telling along the way. People need to see that even the smallest steps forward can make a difference. That evening, as they returned home, Clarence reflected on Martha's words. The event had been more challenging than he'd anticipated, and doubts still lingered. Yet, as he sat on the porch with Hank beside him, the memory of the crowd's cheers and Hank's small victories brought a sense of quiet pride. They had faced a challenge together, and while the road ahead was long, Clarence felt a renewed determination. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Clarence turned to Hank. "What'd he say, old boy? Should we keep showing them what we're made of?" Hank, his tail wagging softly, nudged Clarence's hand. It wasn't much, but it was enough. As summer rolled in, the rhythm of Clarence and Hank's life steadied. Their daily walks lengthened ever so slightly, and Hank's trips to the pool grew more vigorous. His once lumbering gait had become lighter, and the soft folds around his frame began to give way to defined curves of muscle. Hank's progress wasn't just visible, it was palpable in his energy. He greeted Clarence each morning with a wagging tail, his enthusiasm a far cry from the sluggish indifference of their early days. For Clarence, the transformation was more than physical. Caring for Hank had changed his perspective. The eccentric millionaire who once thrived on whimsical bets now found joy in quiet moments, sitting under the shade of a tree, watching Hank explore the backyard with newfound curiosity, or preparing carefully measured meals that balanced health and indulgence. Each small act reminded Clarence that their journey was never about proving something to others, but about the bond they shared. One bright morning, Martha joined them for a walk, her steady chatter filling the air. "You've made quite the pair," she said, glancing at Hank, who trotted beside them with surprising ease. "You've done good, Clarence. The whole neighborhood thinks so." Clarence chuckled, shaking his head. "Not sure the whole neighborhood would agree, but thank you, Martha." He looked to Hank, who was sniffing a patch of wildflowers. "He's done most of the work. I've just followed his lead." Martha smiled knowingly, but didn't press further. She had seen the way Clarence poured himself into caring for Hank, and she knew the effort hadn't gone unnoticed. Slowly but surely, the community's perception had shifted. Once dismissive whispers had turned into nods of encouragement and even admiration. Martha had heard of a few families inspired to adopt overlooked pets themselves, all crediting Clarence and Hank's journey. The final confirmation of their progress came unexpectedly. One afternoon, as Clarence and Hank rested in the park where their story began, a young couple approached. The woman smiled nervously, holding the leash of a wiry terrier. "Excuse me," she began, "but are you the man with the golden retriever? We've heard so much about you too." Clarence blinked in surprise, glancing at Hank, who sat alert, his head tilted curiously. "That depends," Clarence replied with a grin. "Is what you've heard good?" The couple laughed, and the man nodded. "We adopted this little guy last week after hearing about your story. We figured if you could do it, maybe we could too." The words struck Clarence deeply. He thanked the couple, his chest swelling with quiet pride. As they walked away, Hank leaned against Clarence's leg, his tail wagging gently. "Well, old boy," Clarence murmured, stroking Hank's ears, "looks like you're an inspiration now." That evening, Clarence sat on the porch with Hank at his side. The sun dipped low, painting the sky with warm hues of orange and pink. For the first time in months, Clarence allowed himself to reflect on their journey without the weight of doubt. Hank's transformation was undeniable, but the most profound change had been within Clarence himself. He had discovered a purpose he never knew he needed, a quiet, steady kind of fulfillment that had eluded him in his years of restless ambition. As the stars began to dot the night sky, Clarence turned to Hank. "You've taught me a thing or two about patience, haven't you?" he said softly. Hank looked up, his eyes shining with trust. Clarence chuckled. "Guess that makes us both learners in this partnership." The weeks that followed solidified their new routine. Clarence and Hank continued their walks and swims, but the pressure to meet others' expectations had melted away. It wasn't about proving doubters wrong anymore. It was about embracing the life they had built together. One day, as they strolled through the neighborhood, a passerby stopped to admire Hank. "He looks incredible," the man said, his tone genuinely impressed. "You must be proud." Clarence nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I am," he replied simply. "But it's not just about how he looks. It's about the journey we've shared." The man nodded thoughtfully, tipping his hat before walking on. Clarence watched him go, then looked down at Hank, who was wagging his tail contentedly. "Come on, buddy," Clarence said. "Let's head home." As they reached their porch, Hank paused, looking back at Clarence with an alertness that seemed to say, "What's next?" Clarence laughed, patting Hank's side. "Don't worry, there's plenty more ahead for us." The sun dipped below the horizon as they stepped inside, their shadows stretching long across the wooden floor. The house, once quiet and unremarkable, now felt alive with their shared presence. Clarence realized then that their journey wasn't just about transforming Hank. It had been about finding joy in the simplest of moments. The story ended as it had begun, with Clarence and Hank together, ready to face whatever came next. The journey wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and that made it extraordinary.